Welcome to the Home Ludens podcast about history and war games. Specifically, the podcast this week about Le Club de Jeu. We've been playing Plantagenet this week, a game in the Levy and Campaign series published by GMT. I say this week, actually been for about a month or two. Recently, we've changed the format of Le Club de Jeu to make it so we're not really constrained to playing a game over a month. We're playing it until we feel pretty comfortable that we have something interesting to say about it. So if you want to join Le Club de Jeu for the next month's games, plural, do join the Home Ludens Discord channel. There'll be a link in the description of the podcast of how to join and all of that. This week I'm joined by Stuart, Russ, and Chris, all from the Discord. And why don't you guys say hello?
Oh,
Hello.
And yeah, we've all played, I think, Levy and Campaign before, and I think we've all played Plantagenet a decent amount by this time. All different amounts, you know, we're not veterans, I think. None of us are veterans, but I think we're all pretty comfortable with the game. Stuart, I think, will give us the sort of historical background in a second. But I think it's fair to say that this is maybe the most accessible game rules-wise, but also the most accessible game in the series to play from an online standpoint. You can play it on Rally the Troops. That's how we've mostly played it, but I'm sure we'll get to it later in the podcast. So Stuart, go ahead. Give us some historical background on what the hell is going on.
It is about the Wars of the Roses, as you may or may not have guessed. And the Wars of the Roses are an incredibly complicated civil war that happened in England between about 1455 and 1485. And I don't really have the capacity to go through all of it in detail, but I'll try and provide a brief summary. It's obviously because to be a real historical analysis, we have to start unreasonably early. So the Wars of the Roses really begin in 1399. The key thing to know really... We'll be brief. Edward III had three main sons that are relevant to this. He had loads of other kids. We don't care about them for this. Important sons are the Black Prince, Lionel of Clarence, and John of Gaunt. They are in that order. There is another son in there who dies young. We don't care about him. So Black Prince died young without becoming king. His son became King Richard II. In 1399, the son of John of Gaunt, Henry IV, deposed Richard II and took the throne for himself and established the Lancastrian dynasty in England. The Lancastrians include famous kings like Henry V and shittier kings like Henry VI. And over the course of the 15th century, the first half of the 15th century, they conquer a bunch of France. They lose all that holding in France, and they have quite a discordant rule as usurpers and as with the kind of ebb and flow of war in France and the financial struggles that it triggers. So what's important is that Lionel, Duke of Clarence, is the elder line, and they have, through that line, basically marry into the Duchy of York. And so you have this Yorkist family who were kind of skipped over by Henry IV when he usurped. And there's this tension there, this fear of a usurper dynasty, that the other dynasty from primogeniture might interfere. And so that tension exists and is largely managed for much of the first half of the 15th century, but with the collapse of English France and the instability of Henry VI's rule, it begins to trigger this civil war. It sort of begins in 1455 when Richard, Duke of York, captures Henry VI at the First Battle of St. Albans. But really, First St. Albans kind of stands out a bit because there isn't really any fighting then for another couple of years, and the Civil War really kicks off at the end of the 1450s. And the key thing to have is in 1460, or skipping a lot of stuff, but in 1460, Richard, Duke of York, is killed at the Battle of Wakefield. His son, Edward, the Earl of March, inherits the Yorkist claim to the throne. He then, in 1461, at the Battle of Towton, after winning several battles, the Battle of Towton, which is the largest battle ever fought in England. So, fun fact, I think it's also fought in a blizzard. It's a wild battle. He basically seizes the throne for himself. He takes Henry VI captive. Henry VI's wife and son flee to Scotland and then later flee to France because Margaret is a cousin of the King of France, Louis XI. And then Edward IV is kind of king for about a decade in England at that time, before in 1470, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker, who had been instrumental in helping to win Edward's victory at Towton, then decides basically to lead a rebellion against Edward. And so he, in 1470, puts Henry VI back on the throne with support from the Burgundians and other factions. And then in 1471, Edward IV proceeds to kill the ever-loving fuck out of everyone who opposes him. That's the technical term. Particularly the battles of Barnet, he kills Warwick, and then at Tewkesbury, he wins victory again. He kills the son of Henry VI, so there's no longer an heir. Henry VI dies of grief, inverted quotes there, for being murdered. And then basically Edward IV is an undisputed king in theory. That lasts until about 1483 when he dies quite young. And then he has two sons, the princes in the tower, which you may or may not have heard of. And in theory, they will take the throne from him. Instead, his brother Richard kills them, takes the throne. I'm sorry, Ricardians, but I'm not sorry. He kills them, takes the throne, and then is killed himself by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. I won't go into Henry Tudor. He has a very tenuous claim to the throne, but he's vaguely related to the Lancastrians. And he becomes Henry VII, and then we get the Tudor dynasty from that. So that's a potted version. There's a lot of individual wars, I think, is the thing to take away from that feeds into the game, is that these are distinct violences that happen often with about a decade in between them.
Yeah, I mean, it's super simple, really easy to understand all that and to keep track of it all.
They keep killing people off and replacing them with new nobles, so there's it's like you start watching a show and there's a new cast every season. It's so confusing. And they kill people and give other people their titles, so you're like, oh, well, this guy, he's not the same guy as the guy earlier.
But that rotating cast, I think, is something that we do see in this game, which is quite nice. Thanks, Stuart, by the way. That's amazing to have all of that within, I think, 3 minutes. But I'm going to throw it to Russ and to Chris to ask what's your experience playing this game? How much have you played? What's your experience with the Levian campaign as a whole? And how did you play this game? Russ, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I guess I can start just loving and campaign in general. I've played a lot of Nevsky, so I'm most familiar with that. I've dabbled a little bit in Inferno, and then I played this one. And all of my plays, except Inferno, but so Nevsky and Plantagenet, has all been on Rally the Troops.
And I think it's such a good way to play it as well. It's so smooth. It's a decent way to learn the game as well. Usually I don't really think that with a lot of Rally the Troops things or online implementations, but I think it's really effective for this especially.
Yeah, it's so procedural, but it helps kind of roll through that.
Exactly. And Chris, how about you?
Yeah, pretty similar, to be honest. My experience of the system overall is quite small. To my shame, I was quite skeptical about it when it first started coming out, and I've kind of done a bit of a 180 on it now. I think I was just being contrary and saw how popular it had gotten, how quickly, and how many games appeared out of nowhere. I was like, okay, this is like that time when everybody in the world had a coin design in their back pocket that they were working on.
I think I had the exact first impression to it as well, and I quite early on I peeked behind the curtain into the Levian campaign Discord server and realized just how many are being made, and it does feel like it's like, oh Christ, that's a lot.
This is the new system now, so
exactly.
I kind of stayed away from it for a little bit until probably just before Inferno came out, and then I started paying some proper attention to it. So I played Inferno a couple of times for the short scenarios there. Foolishly figured I could just port that directly into playing Nevsky on Rally the Troops, and that didn't go especially well. And then I think you said before, Plantagenet seems to be the more approachable one that's been released. I definitely agree with that. I think I've played it a couple of times with the Somerset's Return scenario in kind of real life, and then especially as part of this, quite a bit on Rally the Troops. I think I'm up to about 10 games of different scenarios, mostly Somerset's Return, but then a couple of the sort of larger ones as well. I'm still terrible at it, but I've played it enough now, I think.
I haven't played against Russ, but I think we can all comfortably say that everyone is terrible at Levian campaign. You're always going to make your army explode, and
yeah, I think that's like the one defining quality of the system, right? Is everyone is bad at
it.
You develop strategy about game 10 to 15. I think that's when that starts kicking in, because up until then it's just trying to function.
And it takes another 10 games to actually implement the strategy. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so once I hit play 40 and I start to get a modicum better,
Exactly.
I'll come back and I'll be like, yeah, look how well I did, and we'll have moved on to game 8 of the series by then, I'm sure.
And Stuart, what's your experience with this? Plantagenet itself, but also Levian campaign as a whole.
So I played quite a lot of Levian campaign. I started playing around the time Almoravid came out. I think Almoravid was like shipping when I got Nevsky.
Hmm.
And so I played Nevsky a little bit, and then I played it loads when it came on Rally the Troops. So I played 10 to 15 games of Nevsky, and then 5 games of Almoravid. Only a couple of Inferno. I really want to get back and play more Inferno, and then I probably played about 6 or 7 games of Plantagenet on Rally the Troops for this. And yeah, I really like it. I played a couple of the ones that aren't out yet as well, I should say.
Yeah.
I tested a few of them. So I'm in pretty deep at this point. I'd say moderately competent at Nevsky, and that's about as far as we're prepared to admit. I think an interesting thing about Plantagenet is I would say it's definitely the easiest entry point for someone who's coming into the series.
Yeah.
But I do think it is one that's much harder to move laterally. Like in ways, I felt like the fact that I played so much hindered me initially learning it, because I was used to like going from Nevsky to Almoravid to Inferno. I got into the habit where I could just like read the sections that are different and then play the game. That kind of like, you already know the core. Here's the 6 things you need to know that are different, and then you play.
Yeah.
Versus Plantagenet feels like it's a much more ground up rebuild of a lot of the key ideas. And that's really cool. And I think it's one of the things that makes the game great and is one of its selling points. But it is like, instead of just skimming the rulebook for the details, I had to read the rulebook again from the start. So I felt much more like someone learning the game for the first time. But it is still, I think, much more approachable than the others are.
I completely agree. And I mean, my experience is that I've played a lot of Nevsky, both in person and through Rally the Troops. I've played quite a bit of the unreleased games thus far, a decent bit of Seljuk and Henry. And I haven't actually played any of the other, like Inferno I haven't played, Almoravid I haven't actually played. Never owned it either. And then quite a bit of Plantagenet. Again, I've played it in person as well as on Rally the Troops. And I think my initial impression of Plantagenet was what I envisioned the system to be before I encountered the system, if that makes sense. So I think it just clicked with me a lot faster than I thought it would. It felt a lot smoother playing than the other ones. And I really like the pretty big changes that they've made, namely to sieges and the influence point system. I think that was really cool. But I think I want to talk, sort of refer to part of the historical background that Stuart mentioned, where we really get the impression that there are distinct phases to the War of the Roses. And how do you think that came through in this game? Anyone can jump in. Like, how do you think the phases of the how many years did it take? Was it like 40 years or so? A bit less than
30 years.
Yeah, 30 years. How do you think that felt in the game? Did you feel like it reflected that? Do you feel like you were playing history, or do you feel like it was just lots of individual scenarios?
For me, compared to Nevsky, the scenarios there just feel like we took the whole game and just give you different sections. Whereas Plantagenet feels like every scenario is its own thing going on a lot more organically.
I think I agree. And I mean, Chris, do you agree with that? Do you feel like it's entirely different stories being told in each scenario?
I think so. Yeah, I think the sort of main actors being different and the different size of it makes it feel different. One thing I haven't had a chance to do, and this is way down the road, I'm really looking forward to it, is the kind of full campaign scenario with full Wars of the Roses, the air system, all of that sort of stuff, which I can see it on the horizon, and it's exciting, but it's we're not there yet.
Yeah, I don't think any of us have played that, and I desperately want to try it too.
I imagine it's not available on other troops yet, and that feels like a huge barrier, at least for me, because that's like approximately 15 turn scenarios, and in Levian campaign, if you're really going fast, a turn is like 40 minutes, and often it's going to be like an hour, like if you're playing them live or in person or anything. So, and I think Plantagenet's maybe a little bit quicker than that, because you tend to not have too many lords at a time, but it does feel like that's, you're probably looking at like 30 to 40 hours of game to do that. And that's daunting. But I am really keen to try it. I think it's very cool potential to have that in that, and have the branching different scenario options based on who is the king going into the next scenario.
I like that a lot. And I mean, when you say 30 to 40 hours of gaming, it feels like a sort of monster game. But I'd push back and say, no, it's not a monster game at all. These are 3 distinct sessions. These are 3 distinct setups. You're setting it up and putting it down each time, and it's easy to record between games. I think something that mechanically does change between the phases are how the Arts of War cards are shown. Obviously, there's the Lords. You'll have different characters and Lords. But in the Arts of War cards, you'll have, I think some of them are just for every scenario. Some of them have 1 rose on them. Some of them have 2 roses, and some of them have 3 roses, indicating how late they are or early they are in the War of the Roses. And I think that's a really nice sort of way to drop some flavor into it and drop some history into it without it feeling like I don't know, Thomas Stanley can turn up in every single era. It makes sense that he's only in the later era rather than the early era, and that's quite cool, I think.
It also adds a little bit, I think, and maybe I'd be interested if people think about this from other Levian campaigns, that the lords have quite a bit more going on than normal. Like in Nevsky, they have a lordship and a command, and that's the lord. How much does he levy? How much does he campaign? Versus in this, you have both the influence system, which we haven't really talked about. We'll talk about, I think, later, which is like probably the single biggest change to the whole game. And then also they have valor, which affects how good they are in combat. So now you have 4 stats, and so then that's a lot more to play with in the designs. You can get very different feeling lords, where like some lords are like someone like Henry VI has amazing influence and 0 valor. Valor gives basically rerolls in combat, which is super powerful. So you kind of have that different feeling of like, oh, this guy's good at fighting, this guy's good at influencing, and that mixes it up a little more. And then the lord mix you have in each scenario then feels very different. It doesn't feel like in Nevsky or them. It often feels like you have your shit lords and your good lords. And that's kind of the variety you get. Versus this, there's a lot more nuance to how good each lord is, and that means that the mix you have in a scenario can really change how you're going to play it.
No, I totally agree.
I think that was a really neat way of doing it as well. We will have seen other games, or what they could have done was had vast asymmetry between all the different lords, and this one acts weirdly, and there's all of these exceptions and things you have to reference and look up. And I think, for a small amount of grit or overhead, it has added, a nice amount of kind of difference between them. And I think it's a really kind of elegant way of getting where they want it to be with it. I think.
Yeah, it adds nuance without too much more weight, and I think that's really key when especially with the War of the Roses. I don't know how it is for you, Russ or Stuart, but growing up, the main thing that I took away from school when I learned about this was just the different characters rather than the actual history. So it's nice that they are represented, like the characters are represented. Like you might have a lord who has amazing influence. Like I think Henry Tudor has amazing influence, but not that great other stats. Whereas other lords might have a ton of valor and not great other stats, and that's neat, and that makes you want to build your lords differently with the different cards you have and the different troops you can recruit.
And they can change between scenarios. Like Edward IV is different in different scenarios because you have Edward when he's an earl who has shit influence and really good valor. And then when he becomes king, he gets a bunch of influence. So in the later scenarios, so there's that fun thing as well where they can change throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think we should probably move on to the system, the core mechanic that you mentioned being so different. I think I want to take each of your takes on it, each of your takes on this, on the influence mechanic, and how did it make you feel when you first saw it, and how do you feel about it now once you played around it more? Russ, go ahead. What do you think about the influence mechanic?
So the first time, I did the normal rally the troops thing. I thought, I played some Nevsky, I played some Inferno. Let's just fire this up and I'll just start pushing buttons and I'll learn it as I go. And boy, did I lose even more than normal.
Yeah.
And then I decided maybe I should read the rule book first before I go on. And I think it's a cool little twist that again can take the bones of the Levian campaign system, but add that kind of idea of kind of politics into the whole thing, without again being some real crazy going on. Right, you're trying to influence all these towns. Hey, come to my side. No, come back over here. And this idea of that kind of the shifting dynamics of factions and counter factions and things going on, with again using that system. And it really struck me. I mean, Levian campaign is not a combat kind of focus system at all. But like,
No.
I think the first 3 games, I don't think we fought a single combat. It was just moving around more like an area control game of,
Yeah.
I'm going to move over
Yeah.
here and I'm going to take your influence away here and then I'm going to build it over here.
And threaten combat, but not actually commit to it. Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so I think me said almost a threat of like, okay, I'm moving here. Well, crap, now if he's going to approach me, well, I don't want to go there, so maybe I'll come around this way. And there was a lot of kind of shifting armies around and kind of picking up, ooh, I need another city, so I'm going to go over here and get this city, or I need a stronghold, well, I'm going to go get this stronghold, in the different towns and trying to kind of win them over to your side. So again, I think it puts a completely different flavor on what you're trying to do in the system.
I completely agree. And I mean, before I move on to Chris or Stuart, just to explain that what the influence mechanic is really is this sliding scale from 0 to 45, I think it is, where you use influence points to take towns and cities and castles. You're not besieging them. You're parlaying with them and convincing them to come onto your side. When you do that, your influence goes down. Once it goes down, so I mean, and when I say it's a sliding scale, if you're at 3 and you use a parlay mechanic, it'll go to 2, 1, 0, and then it'll climb up 1, 2, 3 on the enemy's side. And so it is this tug of war. The person who controls the most fortresses gets more influence, more towns gets more influence, more cities gets more influence at each turn. If you control the south, you get more influence. If you control, I don't know, London, key areas on the map. So there's ways to generate it. There's ways to spend and keep it. So it is quite interesting and a very, very different sort of launch off from the other systems. Chris, what do you think about it?
I really like it. I think this is the thing that's been added that has kind of made this entry really kind of sing for me compared to the others, which I've got less experience with. With Inferno and to a lesser extent Nevsky, I kind of felt the pacing was sometimes quite slow, and I know that that's kind of how it has to be, thematically,
Sure.
and that's the point. It's the point of the system, right? And it felt like, okay, well, this turn I'm going to gather up some Preventer, and then the next turn I'm going to move, and it's that kind of slow trudge towards a siege and then a fight, and that's fine. That's the way it's supposed to be and everything. And I feel like the influence in the parlay, it sort of gives you a little bit more to do on a given turn. So it's not, I mean, I don't want to say rote because that's not what it is, but it's,
I know.
Yeah, it just gives you a little bit more to do around kind of your big turns. So I really like it. I find it super interesting. Again, I don't think we mentioned it, but influence is kind of analogous to VP as well. So
yeah.
Every time you spend it, you're kind of worsening your position unless you're kind of good with it. I really like that aspect. The one thing I will say, with my limited experience, I think it's a bit of a trap, in so much as, I mean, I've just finished a game with Stuart now where I'm focusing on parlaying. I'm kind of remotely kind of picking up these kind of regions through. Because again, you can influence over pathways and roads. You don't have to be in the space. And I was concentrating so much on that all of a sudden I've been rammed into by a sizable army. And like, okay, well, what I should have been doing was levying more troops and treating this, and instead I'm treating it like a Twilight Struggle or something, where I'm kind of trying to influence other things. Yeah, so there's a balance in there somewhere, but I think I think the influence system, we said it was the biggest change compared to the others in the series, and for me, I think it's the killer sort of thing that they've added that I really enjoy. Yeah,
absolutely, and I think I'd agree. To one of your first points, it's sort of like it feels less procedural. Your turn. It feels like you're less doing sort of this, then this, then this, then this. You have this section where you're just sort of thinking, oh, you've got a whole more sort of infinite more options of what you should be doing and where you should be going and what you're indicating to your opponent when you try and influence a certain town or in a certain direction. And I quite like that. It adds an interesting layer. Stuart, what do you think about it?
I like it a lot. I think so. Most people have kind of said the points that I would agree with. I think to kind of come back to the example, the game I was playing with Chris just now, an interesting thing about it, I think, as well, is that it feels like there's this tipping point when you're playing it. So we were playing Somerset, which is quite a short scenario, and basically the influence had gone away from me. I was York, and I knew it wasn't coming back my way. So then you just you shift gears, and you're like, I just have to kill him now.
Yeah,
that's how it has to be. The way out of this is that I have to kill him. And that I think is really interesting, because I think something that is an interesting struggle in Levy campaign and in kind of games like this. In a lot of ways, is that battles were historically a bad idea, and the system I think reflects how gambly a battle is and always has. Felt very dicey and unreliable to do a battle. So it's like, well, why would you do it? And Plantagenet, I think, does a really good job of conveying that, being like, well, you're losing in every other front, so your way out of this is fucking kill everyone. Like that's how you're gonna get out of this problem. And the map is really clever with the highways and stuff, which give you an extra free move. You can move really far in a single turn. Like literally in 2 activations, I had Warwick go from London to past York. Like I was in the north of England and I plowed through 2 Lancastrian armies on my way there. It's just like once you're primed to be a missile and you've got this huge army, you can just launch yourself at people. And I think things like in the longer scenarios, it's mitigated a bit by you have the exile option, and you can kind of ebb and flow a little bit more like that. So you can get a point where like, oh, I'm losing too badly on the influence. I have to like kill some people, but then they run away, which does get you some influence. So you become a bit more stable again, but then they're going to come back in a couple turns, and then you're going to have to deal with them again. So that I think as well, it feels very different in like the big 15 turn games where you have to kind of time exactly when that's going to be. But I do like that because there's a degree of like you want to be winning an influence, but you don't want to be winning too much because then they might throw everything to the wind and just go all in on trying to kill you, and then that could be a really big problem.
Which I think feels quite historic as well. It feels quite nice where when you're in a dire political situation, what you need is a big win. You need a big impactful victory, and the easiest way to do that, the most effective way to do that is winning a battle, a decisive battle, and that feels really good. And on the subject of battles, how many of you have played with hidden mats at all?
I actually haven't yet. I really want to, but that feels like that's gonna ratchet everything up.
It's my favorite way to play.
I've tried it. Yeah, I haven't yet either. I've just been
it's
playing
so
in the kind of standard way. So I'd be interested to do that because again, going back to the game I played with Stuart, I could see this boulder coming. Yeah, it's another thing as well. Stuart was far more brave with his resources. There's a psychological barrier I have with Levy and campaign generally, where it's like, oh, I don't want too many troops because then I've got to feed them somehow.
Exactly.
And I could see this map further down the map, and every time you get that option, like, hey, do you want to intercept? And you sort of go and you have a look, and like, fuck no, I don't want to intercept it. That's ridiculous.
What are you talking about?
It's a losing prospect anyway, because if you don't intercept, he's going to come into you anyway.
Exactly.
So I think the hidden mats is one for me to try in the future.
Definitely try it.
Nice,
because you can pretend to be that boulder. It's so nice when you're like barreling towards someone and you've got nothing on your mat. What about you, Russ? Have you tried it? Would you want to try it?
Not in this one. I've done it in Nevsky, and oh my god, it is tense. Every move, you're clenched pretty tight.
Exactly. Especially, I think in Nevsky, it's very interesting with how the movement works differently. You've got a lot more different sort of rivers to worry about, different vehicles or carts and sleds to worry about. So having those hidden mats, when you see an army coming towards you and not knowing whether they have the capability to chase you across that sort of river, is really cool, I think, and something that you do find a bit less in this one.
Yeah, I would say a difference I feel in Plantagenet as you're talking about the different like pace of it, the feel of playing it. I think Plantagenet is more forgiving in ways of like there's more sources for food on the map. Taxation is much easier to do, although it is also much more crucial because you don't have to tax in the space you're in. It doesn't take your whole activation. It does take an influence check. It does basically cost you a victory point, and you do have to pay your troops every single turn. So you are going to be taxing all the time. So it does have that difference, but I find like it is kind of easier to wing it. Like if something goes wrong, you have a bit more flexibility in what you can do. Whereas something like Nevsky, I mean, it's a crude comparison, but it feels a little bit like Robo Rally sometimes, where like partway through your turn, you realize you put the wrong card in there and everything just fucking cascades. And it's just like, I've just ruined everything. It's all, this turn is a wipe.
It's
We're
a
done.
wash. Yeah.
It's just like, I've completely screwed this up. And that feeling of satisfaction when you actually get competent enough in Nevsky to execute turns reliably is so good. And I'd say Plantagenet is a lot more forgiving in that way. Like it gives you more tools, but then it punishes you more subtly. I think like it's a slower whittling down of like your position and your control, and you kind of it just each mistake stacks until eventually you're like 2 turns later, you're like, I've completely made a hams of this.
And I mean, the punishment for completely screwing it up is really fun as well. I think it's less. I mean, it's depressing when it happens, but when you can't tax your men, when you can't feed them, when you can't tax them, whatever, your men. I can't remember what it's called. It's basically they lay waste and they loot.
Yeah, they pillage. I think it's pillage.
Yeah, it's pillage. Yeah. They pillage from every nearby locale, which is awesome. It basically switches every nearby locale to your opponent's color, but your lord stays on the map, which is cool.
Well,
you know?
Usually. There's the very awful experience where you pillage, still don't get enough resources, and they go away anyway, which is awful.
Why, Stuart? I'm not that bad.
Oh, it definitely hasn't happened to me. Don't worry.
But no, I think that's really cool, and that adds to the narrative of playing. I always talk about like the narrative of how a game feels, and getting that second chance, losing all those influence points and everything. But if you were ahead in influence points, who cares if you lost those? If you do get to overstretch your army a little bit and get into the enemy lands.
I also did have someone missile a lord at me rather than let him pillage, which was pretty funny. They were just like, he's got no money and he's got a decent sized army. He's gonna go fight this battle now.
Yeah,
that's it. I'm out of cash. He's got to
He's
fight.
gone.
He's got to go.
No, absolutely. And I think something we haven't talked about, we've touched on it a little bit about ease of taxation, ease of getting these resources. But I really like the exhausted and depleted system with each locale. I don't know, Chris or Russ, feel free to speak on it. But
yeah, so like unlike Nevsky, where you can just, I'm going to get supplies here, I'm going to tax here, and you just kind of do that for your actions, you're slowly kind of draining the resources of each location. Yeah. So you can't just turtle and sit at one spot and keep, spamming your tax,
pressing the button,
and racking up your coin like you could in Nevsky. And like, okay, I'm to this turn, this guy's going to sit here. He's going to have 3 activations in my command deck, and he's just going to stack up on coin so that next turn he can go launch out and go do something. You're not going to do that in Plantagenet because you're going to completely exhaust that spot. And now I got to go to the next town and I got to start soaking it of resources. So it keeps you kind of on the move and kind of thinking through it. It's a different type of logistic, in Nevsky, it's the transportation, but now here it's like, okay, transportation's easy. I got my carts fine. I can move my provender, great. But where am I getting it from, and where am I getting my coin, and how am I going to keep moving around to the spots I need to go? Because I got to go flip influence over here, but then I got to make sure I'm getting the money, so I don't just undo all that and have them pillage and just. So again, it's a different type of logistical puzzle. Again, pretty simple.
It's pretty simple, but I think it's really interesting because you can create those sort of scorched earth tactics quite naturally, where you're running away from a lord, and you have enough food, but you just get a little bit more, so that when the lord gets behind you and gets into like how you are once you've escaped, they can't draw any food from there. And it's really cool, or men, or tax, or anything like that. And I like that there are 2 levels of being exhausted and depleted. I like that it's everywhere across the board as well, where it works the same. And it's a really harsh system, I think, but also it just feels really natural when halfway through a game you're looking at the board and you're desperately trying to like squint for that one free location that hasn't been foraged yet or supplied from yet.
I would say I always tax London before I walk away because I'm
Absolutely.
like, I don't want you to be able to tax London.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's another area where, like Stuart said, it's not Robo Rally, but it's not a million miles away. Where you've got these other options to do, and it's another thing where if something falls slightly out of order, then suddenly you're hosed. So, like Russ said, you've depleted everywhere around you. You need to get some more. Okay, I need to get some more money. Oh, I can't. I've got to parlay that space first of all. And if things don't happen in the right order, then everything kind of falls apart, and then you can't pay your lords, and they bugger off somewhere. And it's a small change and a small kind of thing to consider. But yeah, the kind of sequencing of it means that you have to kind of think a lot more, and it's something that I'm terrible at doing. So it's sometimes frustrating, but I think it adds a lot for not much.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know. I'm going to just list down the little mechanics that are different that we haven't mentioned.
Before we get to that, actually, I wanted to ask you and Chris, since you played it in person, how is that in person? 'Cause it does feel like each space, you've got depleted, exhausted markers. You've also got, which
Yeah.
side is aligned to the marker, and then you've got the lords and everything. Like, how does that? And the board is quite small. So how
Yeah.
does that feel as an in person? Because in Rally of the Troops, it's obviously incredibly smooth. But
Yeah.
how is that in
So
person to play?
for me, in person, it's fine as long as you're not doing it too much in Cambridgeshire, where sort of everywhere around Cambridge, you have maybe half an inch between each locale, and the counters are either half an inch big or bigger.
Yeah.
So it does feel a bit crowded, and I think that is definitely my one big gripe with the map. There's a lot of space in Wales they could have squashed, where they could have made a lot more space.
Careful now.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think I'd agree. It's not really become much of a concern where I played it. Again, it was the smaller scenarios. I don't know if it becomes this huge morass when you're playing the larger sort of thing where you've got loads of kind of lords and things kind of floating around. The inverse, I think the one area where the kind of playing in real life is a lot more user friendly, and this might just be because I'm stupid. Stuart, you'll be aware of this. There's been a couple of times now where playing on Rally the Troops, I've done a move and I've thought, right, okay, here we go. I'm all set. I've got plenty of preventer here. I can do it. And then when it's too late to undo it, I realise that what I've actually been looking at is the starting resources for that lord that's printed on that
Yes.
card.
Yeah.
And that isn't an issue when you're playing it in real life, because you can clearly delineate between here's the card that's for the lord, here's the chit that's there as the actual kind of preventer or coin or whatever else you're kind of worrying about. And on Rally the Troops, which again, it's a fantastic system, I'm really happy with it. I think it's a great way to make it accessible for us to play it, because it's just a single flat image. If you're stupid like I sometimes am, you sort of look at the wrong part of the mat and then you're like, oh, okay,
No, it's very
that's
easy to
caused a
make
problem.
that. I'm not saying that I've done that. Absolutely not. But it's very easy to make that, and
could never be you.
Could never be
Many
me.
people you play against make that mistake, but never you.
Never me. Yeah, never. No, absolutely. I agree. It feels more. I don't know, and I think I keep track of my resources more when it's in person as well. But that's I think that the map itself, fine. It could have had a bit more work. It's beautiful. It looks really pretty. But actual playability wise, it could have had a little bit more work, I think. I mean, how about the Vassals? We haven't talked about the Vassals. I'll say my opinion about the Vassals. I really like them. I think they're really cool. I always like it in games when you can get a little coat of arms with a name underneath it. It's part of the reason why I love Men of Iron so much, that you can get all these named characters going around the map doing what they want, and you can sort of like Pokemon walk around the map on this and get the loyalty of each of these vassals, and they act on your battle board, on that lord's battle board, as an extra retinue. I think basically almost the equivalent of like a knight, basically, and they're really, really, really effective and quite cool. It's definitely a layer of Chrome, a whole sort of probably page of rules that you could lift out, and I don't know if you'd lose that much.
What you would lose would depend a bit on the scenario as well, though, because they also enable taxation at their home.
That's very true.
And so something like, I remember I first came to appreciate Vassals. Probably I've played like 3 or 4 games before, but I played the My Kingdom for a Horse, which is the Richard III scenario, the final one.
Yeah.
Chronologically, and in that there's no recovery. So normally, when you have the wasting of the regions, there's a certain couple of turns where things regrow and everything gets improved. And in the Richard III scenario, none of that happens. You're just only devastating. And there was a point where I'd built a giant, horrible Death Star under Richard, and I had realized that I was running out of places to make money.
Yeah.
And then I was like, I went to the rulebook and I was like, how can I make more money? I was like, vassals. I can get vassals. And then I really began to appreciate. I'm like, oh, they do actually enable this. Like, how can you get extra income and all this stuff? And then they are useful in combat. They're really powerful units in fighting. And so then that's really helped me like adapt. I think they do add like, as you say, you could lift them out and the game would still function. But I do think they are a really appreciated level of Chrome, and they add more options for you to explore. And I think proper use of vassals is probably like key to playing it competently to well.
Exactly, and I think it's going back to my point of the characters shining through in this period, and getting these vassals getting them in an army really helps tell those stories of like the battle you had with Stanley or Dudley on your side, and you managed to go in, and Stanley and Dudley managed to take some hits for you and not die, or the Earl of Shrewsbury had to die or something, but you managed to win anyway. What about you, Russ? What do you think about it?
I think you guys kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's another cool little thing. Again, I'm spending more influence points to get these guys. So again, it's that trick of how much do I want to give up my influence to have this guy here. I'm just now like I'm 5 games in, starting to really kind of now I'm starting to figure out the importance of how to use them well. First couple games, it was like, oh yeah, I can love you. I can try to influence this guy and get him. See what he does. But like you said, the idea of opening up another location for taxation, with grabbing them is definitely good. Having someone else that can soak some hits in combat is definitely good. So yeah, I think it's I get a nice little piece that's in there. And again, I'm with you 100%. Anytime you get coats of arms and names, it just adds that narrative element of, I brought this guy on board. He's a good lieutenant for me. He's you're going through that little battle scenario, and you're just rolling some dice and assigning hits, but in your mind, like, oh, he's taking the flank, and he's taking the hits out here in the vanguard, and you can have that really easily come to mind, with this little counter that's on your mat, which is great.
And do you have anything to add to that, Chris? I think we covered Vassals quite in depth there, but I mean, do you like them? Do you think it's too much?
I do like them. I would agree with all the points that everybody else has hit. I think I'd push back a bit on. I mean, you mentioned the rules, and I don't think there's that much there that is an issue. You mentioned there that there's a page of rules. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but from memory, one thing I really like about this generally is that there's loads of little bits like that, and they all just hinge off of this idea of an influence check. And
that's true.
There's loads of stuff. There's loads of stuff that you do, and the procedure for doing it is an influence check, which is, as we said, you spend some influence, you roll a dice, see what you get. And there's so much of it that is just, hey, do an influence check with this small amount of context added, and that page of rules, in reality, is probably like a paragraph because of all the repeated stuff that's in there from.
I think you're completely right. Stuff. Yeah, you're completely right. I think it's unfair to say that it's that much more of a mental load. You're completely right. Well, I'd like to maybe touch on things we didn't like. What do we think it does badly? Do we think maybe if we want to focus it more, what do we think it does badly in maybe how it simulates the history? What do you think it does especially well when it simulates the history? Like, Stuart, do you want to jump in here? Do you have anything off the top of your head?
Ooh, it's a big one.
I don't mean to speak. I think we're all pretty clear that we've been gushing about this game for the last 45 minutes.
I like it a lot. I would say, I mean, again, it's like the influence adds a nice little extra bit of politics to it, but it is still quite light on the politics of the era. This is like all war has a strong political element, but the Wars of the Roses are very much a war about like the state and what the state being formed and what it means and who's in charge, and there's all these institutions, and it simplifies a lot. It strips out a lot of that. The removal of sieges completely makes sense because there aren't any major sieges in Wars of the Roses, but also means you lose the idea of like fortresses did actually matter, even if they weren't that many of them. Versus in this, the fortresses feel like they're just another thing to control. Like that bit's quite abstract. Like control most cities, control most fortresses, control most towns. But it's like, what does it matter if I control a random fort? Or like controlling Harlech kind of just matters because historically it did matter.
Yeah.
Which just is because the Tudors are Welsh, basically. It feels a little bit like it's teleological in that way, I guess. And there are like little nitpicks I could have that are very minor stuff, like as an event for Cade's Rebellion, which Cade's Rebellion happened in 1450, so it's 5 years before the game began. Now, Cade's Rebellion is a large peasant rebellion in 1450. We don't have to go into details of what it was. But it did have a long legacy, like what it meant, and the fact that the rebels in Cade's Rebellion kind of identified themselves with the Duke of York, meant that it resurfaced kind of as an idea and a political sentiment in the early phases of the Wars of the Roses. So I kind of get that, but I know that because I know a lot about Cade's Rebellion. I don't know if the game conveys that at all. Like there
Sure.
is that bit. This history is really complicated, and I don't, as someone who has spent a long time figuring it out, because I actually really struggled to know what the fuck was going on in the War of the Roses for many years, even after having a PhD in a very similar topic.
Yeah.
I'd be curious how well people feel like they got the history from it. Like, do you feel like you know who the hell these people are if you didn't learn who they like? Russ, actually, I think particularly because you wouldn't have learned about them in school like me.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you know who these people are?
I would say no, not a chance. I have their names. I know who I set up for each scenario. But again, the event cards very, very minimal on kind of flavor of what's going on with them. So I would say that's not really a strong suit. If you want to get like specific events that are happening that in the background, I think it tells narratives in your actions and what's going on the board. So I wouldn't say you're not getting any narrative out of the game, but it's not telling you, like walking you through events like a game like Shores of Tripoli would. Like that, you're kind of getting what's going on, I think, a little bit more with how that plays out.
I think that's a really good point. And I mean, Chris, I don't know how much you learned about the War of the Roses when you were at school, or because you grew up in Wales, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So was it just Owain Glyndŵr and and things like that?
Less than that, you think, because I was in what you kind of consider the English kind of school system within Wales. It was there was, hey, here's Magna Carta, and then a lot of stuff I didn't really pay a huge amount of attention to until we got to World War II, and then brushed over Vietnam and the Cold War and everything. So Wars of the Roses historically has always been like a bit of a black spot for me. I don't really know too much about it. I think I'd probably agree with Russ that there's some names I recognise and some I think one thing that I can kind of hang my hat on is that I know the places at least, because I'm in the UK and I'm familiar with it, and I can pronounce all of the kind of Welsh town names and all that sort of stuff, so that's good. Yeah, so I couldn't speak to kind of how kind of accurate it is or how much it came through, just because it's an area I'm pretty kind of ignorant of. Well, one thing it has done, which I think is usually a mark of a kind of pretty good game, after playing it a bit, I went straight to the designer notes in the back of the playbook and went and picked up a couple of books from the kind of bibliography there. So it's inspiring me to learn more about it, which I'm sure will hopefully make me enjoy the game even more overall.
No, that's I think that's a really good sign of how much a game has impacted you. It's only a few games that has done that to me, namely Library of Napoleonic Battles. Has really got me into an era. I think Plantagenet is going to get me into this era. I know when Nevsky came out, it made me want to do a bit of reading. It's a bit harder to do reading about that in English. But yeah, absolutely. I think that says a lot, doesn't it? That it's made you want to dig into it more, especially as a subject. I think that's pretty infamous amongst in England of being not ugly, but like boring as sin. Like it's so boring to learn about.
Yeah, I think it's just one of the subjects everybody sort of thinks, well, surely you know that. It's like, no,
exactly.
Nothing. Like, there's that many actors and players and people involved and everything, and it's hard to kind of
absolutely
get it straight. Like so, I'm interested in looking at it more.
Mm-hmm.
Something I would say about like trying to learn the War of the Roses, in contrast to, like, so I spent a lot of time studying the 100 Years' War, which is obviously a very famous war, lots of famous people, Joan of Arc is in it and stuff, but I feel like reading that, historians spend a lot more time like holding your hand through it, being like, you don't know who these guys are. We're going to explain it to you. It's okay. And when you read Wars of the Roses, a lot of the history is written by quite posh English people, and it really comes across like, well, we all learned this in Eton, so this is a refresher. And I'm like, we didn't know. I don't know who any of these people are. And particularly because a lot of them are holdovers from the end of the 100 Years' War. If you don't know anything about that, you're just being like, it's straight up being dropped into the middle. Yeah. And it's like, trying to learn about the Napoleonic Wars, and we're starting in like 1808, and we're not going to explain who these people are. You just need to know what happened in the French Revolution. It doesn't matter. like this. I would recommend for people who are interested, David Grummett's A Short History of the Wars of the Roses is a really good introduction. It's like 200 pages. And Grummett actually, like, one of the things he takes as his approach is that it's not taught as much in British schools as it used to be, as it would have been, say, mid 20th century. And so you really cannot assume this pre-existing knowledge. So he ground up, he does like, right, it already starts in 1399. He ground up explains to you what this is and what it means and what's going on and who these people are. And it still gets pretty convoluted just because there are so many people and there is so much happening. But I did find that that's a really good approach. And I'd also recommend, he wrote a shorter biography of Henry VI, I think Rutledge published, that's also really good and covers a lot of the same stuff, obviously, because Henry VI is the king for the first half of it. So that's another great way to learn a lot about the background and this war. So his 2 books, I think, are probably my 2 favorite for being just not too long, very approachable, well-written accounts of the Wars of the Roses.
No, I think that's really helpful. I think, as we've done book recommendations, what about game recommendations? What other games on the War of the Roses do people like? Stuart, what do you think?
I like Richard III from Columbia Games.
Yeah,
it's
you
the
do.
best one. It's the best Columbia game. Fight me. Fight me. It's so good.
Richard III is very good, and I think it leans on that chaos a little bit more than this. And I think that's quite nice.
But they do feel like they have a nice overlap because they are both kind of operational games. Richard III obviously is like 8 pages of rules. It's a lot faster. It's a lot quicker. And it really leans into that battle because you don't have that. But you do actually a bit, because you have how many nobles do you have on the map is an influence thing. Yeah. And you have that little bit of fog of war about how strong you are. Yeah, and key locations. So it is very much a simpler game, but there is a shared lineage. And I would say that, like, if you like one, you probably will like the other. I think they share a lot. They have quite crazy dicey combat. Like, they're great games. And Richard III is so good. I just love it. It's also in Rally of the Troops. You should play it. It's great. The GOAT.
Russ or Chris, do you have any other recommendations for War of the Roses games? Or is this the War of the Roses game for you?
This is the only one I've actually played.
Nice. Yeah.
So I need to hit Richard III.
Yeah, do it. And Chris?
Yeah, exactly the same. It's the only one I've ever done.
Nice.
Richard III is on the docket. I'll look forward to being flandered at that by somebody. And
I'd recommend, I think, if people want a bit more politics in their game, Kingmaker, really, really good. Recently had a 2023 remake, and I believe Fred is going to try and get the latest publisher on the show at some point in the future. We spoke to him at AirCon in 2024. I'd also recommend The Cousins War by Surprise Stare Games. Really small package, really small package, and really, really, really good. Very different scale. It's all card based and bidding how many troops. You're not really getting the the full narrative of the War of the Roses, but it's fun and it's nice and it's small. And finally, if you have the Menavine tri-pack, Blood and Roses is a sort of 1/3 of the tri-pack. It's a standalone game at the moment, but it's definitely the most expensive standalone Menavine game to buy on the secondary market. So just get the tri-pack. It's cheaper than the game on its own, and that's pretty expensive anyway. It's very good. I think it's maybe the most interesting Menavine entry within the tri-pack, and would recommend.
I would say it's got some of the best tweaks to core Menavine. The changes they make to the CRT and the archer tables and everything are really interesting. And yeah, I think there's a sameness to the battles because the armies are almost all identical because it's this civil war of 2 English armies, but it does a lot with the other mechanisms to make it exciting. So it is one of the best refinements of that system.
And it's a nice pairing to this, I think, because they're entirely separate scales. Where some people have learned about the War of the Roses entirely through the battles. You can play the Menavine, but Plantagenet gives you that context behind the battles, and I think that's really cool to see hand in hand a little bit.
Yeah, one I would love to play that I haven't is, I think it's Crown of Roses, the 3-player block game from GMT.
That's really cool.
That is supposed to be kind of a mess, but I love the idea of this big multiplayer, very politics heavy, because you elect members to parliament and stuff, and it's got a.
And similar to Kingmaker, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I would love to try that someday. That's like on my wish list of games to play at some point, even if it's kind of a mess. Apparently, I would still like. That's such a cool idea.
And I think finally there's Son of York by GMT. It's a card game. I don't think any of us have played it. I don't think many people have played it because every time I go to a convention, it's at an insultingly cheap price on the bring and buy table. It's probably good. They may have just printed too many copies of it, but I'd give it a try.
It is like a popular war though. Like those are quite a lot of games for medieval history. Like you don't get very many conflicts in the Middle Ages, except for that and like the Crusades. These are probably the two
Exactly.
biggest
Yeah.
medieval conflicts for wargaming. So that is cool.
Yeah. It's cool. It's cool. It's nice to have variety.
I like Plantagenet a lot. I am still very much on the fence on if I like it more than I like Nevsky, which is right now my favorite. I think they're comparably good games, and I think a lot of it comes down to like basically with Levian Campaign. A thing I love about it, we talked about a lot, is the sense of punishment. These are games for masochists in a way, not from rules load, but just from like the way that the game is going to mistreat you. And I think it's for Plantagenet to Nevsky, to me, it's a question of like, where do you want that to come from? And I love Nevsky's transportation nightmare networks and like getting stuck and that feeling of everything derailing. Versus Plantagenet has a different feel with the influence system, with the spending victory points and all of that. So I like it a lot. I think it's a really good addition to the system. I think in a lot of ways it kind of revitalized some faith in the system, because I think it showed what you can do to that core, how you can change it up and still make it feel recognized with Levian Campaign, but also its distinct own thing. Like, I wouldn't say that any of the mechanisms we talked about today that we liked could be strapped onto just another Levian Campaign as a backdate. Like, it's all custom built to this game. It doesn't feel like just the system applied to a new game. It really stands out as its own. It does a lot of really great stuff. The designer, Paco Gradiles, should feel really proud of himself. This is a really great game. And yeah, I'm really impressed. This could use a few more crossbows, but besides that, it's great. It's a great game.
Fantastic. But Russ, go ahead. What's your review?
I think I feel pretty close to what Stuart said. I mean, Nevsky's still near and dear to my heart. I don't know that this pushes above it, but it does feel fresh in the system, especially after playing a game of Inferno and looking at that. That's like, okay, Nevsky rules with a little bit more thrown in it. Whereas again, this felt like, okay, we're going to boil this thing down and we're going to rebuild it specific to this conflict. I like how it's streamlined some things, but again, I kind of miss the kind of the transportation puzzle. I miss sieges. I actually kind of miss
You're
sieges.
crazy.
I think there's
You're
something. I don't know why, but I think there's something about not only do I got to get here, now I got to fricking find out how to keep feeding these guys while they sit outside this castle until they can break in. And so it kind of loses a little luster there. Because for some reason I like that as another element of getting punished. But other than that, I think it's really good. I got a friend here locally that we've played Nevsky a few times on Rally of the Troops. We haven't quite got in person, but I'd like to introduce him to this, because I think he's not normally a war gamer, but likes logistical kind of games. So he really liked Nevsky, but I'm curious how he'll like this one.
Be a good fit. Yeah,
so I want to try him out.
Sweet. Yeah. And Chris, what do you think?
Agreed with everybody else, really. I can't add kind of too much more beyond what we've already said. I really like that it's somehow more approachable than all of the other games in the series, but also somehow more satisfying as well. Normally it feels like you need to add a load more of that kind of rules grit to get to kind of something novel. So that's good. I'd definitely recommend it. I'm not typically somebody that kind of needs to collect a series. You see people who have every game in the coin series, for example. I'm happy with one coin game and I'm happy with one Levian Campaign game, and unless something kind of revolutionary comes through, kind of like what Stephen's been doing with coin recently with the multi-packs, I think Plantagenet is it's my Levian Campaign game. I think I don't see any reason to kind of switch it up or to look elsewhere, at least for the time being. So I like it a lot.
I think that's a really interesting take, and I think I'd agree completely with you. It's my Levian Campaign game at the moment, and I don't feel the need to own another one. I really, really like Nevsky. I think it's, as Russ said, really good logistical puzzle. It's a different game to me, I think. And whilst I think Nevsky is maybe a better logistical puzzle, because that's what it's leaning into, I don't want to feel stressed the entire time I'm playing. and I think Plantagenet takes off a bit of that stress. It feels like I'm putting on the training wheels a bit more, and I kind of like that, because it's good, dumb fun that can take 2 hours for one scenario or 12 hours for another if you want, which is really cool to see. So that was the Club de Jeu episode on Plantagenet. If you'd like to be part of the next one, or if you'd like to just play the games that we're playing, please do join the Homo Ludens Discord server. Again, details will be on in the description of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.